Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. I'm honored to introduce today's guest, Ambassador Jorge Lomonaco, a prominent figure in Mexican diplomacy with a distinguished career in international affairs. Jorge has made significant contributions as Mexico's ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council, where he played a pivotal role in advancing human rights initiatives on a global scale. Jorge also served as Mexico's ambassador to the Organization of American States, where he was instrumental in shaping regional policies and fostering collaboration among member states. Jorge's extensive experience in human rights, coupled with his role as an international negotiator, including as the chief negotiator of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, makes him an invaluable voice in today's discussion. We are privileged to have him with us today to share his insights and experience. Jorge, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm looking forward to our conversation on a very exciting and, I have to say, difficult topic.
Well, Jorge, let's just dive right into it then. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on the role that human rights protections, as well as accountability for human rights violations within peace processes, how that plays out. So let's start with the big picture. In your experience, how does the protection and promotion of human rights influence the prospects for creating a durable peace?
Well, Paul, let me start from the top. I think we need to remind ourselves all the time that we all have a moral obligation to make human rights part of the conversation every time, on national level, at bilateral conversations, at multilateral level. Human rights should be part of those conversations before conflict, during conflict, and after conflict. And in fact, human rights should be at the top of the issues where the concerns on sovereignty of the states with capital S should be placed in the back seat of the processes. This is where the international community should be engaged and should be meddling with those affairs, human rights violations. And I think that experience have shown that the protection of human rights is essential for durable peace after conflict. This is possibly the only way to guarantee that no repetition and the no additional violations to whatever was the framework in which peace was agreed upon. And of course, inhabitants of a post-conflict, survivors of a post-conflict situation need to be assured that their human rights are protected from then on, at least. And therefore, I consider human rights protection of human rights, an essential tool for durable peace. That is not to say that we have, unfortunately, seen failure even with human rights protections in place for different reasons other than violation of human rights, but that's a different story.
Well, Jorge, let's pick up on that thread of the conversation. And can you share with us any specific instances where incorporating human rights protections into a peace process has significantly influenced the outcome of that process and contributed to a sustainable peace?
While I highlight the importance that protection of human rights have played in durable peace, I, unfortunately, in my experience, have to say that protection of human rights have played a lesser role in the brokerage of peace per se. In fact, if you look at the three major ongoing conflicts that we are facing as we record this pod, Ukraine, Gaza, and Venezuela. In those three cases, we have seen horrible human rights violations. And unfortunately, we have not seen that human rights have played not even a major role, not even a role in the brokerage of peace. The discussions on these three conflicts are about something else other than human rights. In Latin America, we've seen a little bit of that, of a positive experience in terms of the role of human rights in the case of the process of democratization after the military juntas in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and to a certain extent, in more recent years, Colombia. The Commission of Human Rights at the time was involved in looking at abuses taking place in the southern part of Latin America. And I believe that played a role into putting pressure on military juntas and their demise. I'm not sure whether they play a role in the whole brokerage of the peace process, possibly because there was not a major negotiation per se, international negotiation, rather an internal process in which over the years the societies of those countries evolved to a fully democratic stance. And I do believe that human rights play somewhat a role. I'm struggling more to find examples in which a peace negotiation, an international broker peace negotiation has resulted in success in which human rights have played a major role per se. Against South Africa, it's another example, but that was a national process more than anything. There was a lot of pressure, anti-apartheid, the isolation of South Africa, which play a role, and it was because of a major human rights violation, racism, and apartheid. But it was not that it didn't play a key role in the brokering of a peace afterwards. Having said that, again, protection of human rights has been key in all those places that I have mentioned. Afterward.
Well, Jorge, let's flip that around then and talk a little bit about the challenges. Why is it that it's so difficult to protect human rights during times of conflict? And then when the conflict moves into a peace process or a peace negotiation, why is it that human rights aren't front and center in those negotiations?
Well, I'm afraid, in my view, it is because there are other concerns and there are other forces at play when it comes to a negotiation in which you want to get rid of a regime that has been abusive. Case in point would be, hopefully with a good outcome, Venezuela. And we're looking at Venezuela as it evolves now in real time. And what you need to negotiate with the dictator, you need to negotiate with and therefore you need to offer, it's always been him, it's us men, it's been us men. You need to offer him a way out. And that means that usually means, and him and his cronies as well, usually the military, because the military is usually used as a tool for cracking down on democratic protests, on demands, and in the violation of human rights. So you need to get the support for the new democratic regime from the militaries. And the militaries are, to a certain extent, and to most extent, permanent. You may see some movement in the ranks. You may want to get rid of the top ranks, but still you need to support your new government as you do with the civil servants of the previous regime, which will make sure that the oil the machinery is well oiled. So therefore, there has to be a negotiation in which you have to offer something in return for the dictator to leave, and that's usually a safe haven, protection for the family, sometimes for them to keep their material resources, whatever they are, and in many cases, some sort of forgiveness. You may want to call it amnesty. That's probably the A word nowadays, but it is what it is, an amnesty. You need to offer the top ranks of the military that they will not be prosecuted for the crimes they committed while they were protecting the old regime. And therefore, the violation of human rights usually tend to be taken away from prosecution for the new regime to start. And we saw this in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and to a certain extent in Spain here after Franco. There's some sort of forgiveness, amnesty, in order to guarantee some sort of transition and a new regime. And this is where the protection of human rights after peace is achieved is so essential, because that's the only way to guarantee, again, no repetition, and there is no violation from the old regime people on the agreements that were reached for achieving peace.
So, Jorge, in light of those challenges, what can or what has the UN Human Rights Council done to try to promote the protection of human rights during a time of conflict, and to try to make sure that the conversation relating to human rights, so to speak, has a seat at the table in peace negotiations? Special sessions, fact-finding missions, or maybe even utilizing the Universal Periodic Review. What is it that the Council can and could be doing?
Well, I think the most important role that the Council must play is to remain engaged, to keep abreast. And as I said at the outset of this pod, it is before conflict, in order to try to stop the abuses and maybe prevent conflict, because sometimes abuses, as we know, are the indication of escalation and a potential conflict. During conflict, as we have seen the Council playing a major role in the case of Ukraine, and to a certain extent in Gaza, and then after conflict, as we referred to in other cases. So the Council needs to be engaged. The first thing is not to look the other way, and to put in place whatever can be put in place, given the political environment at the time, be it a special session, being a fact-finding mission, instruct the Office of the High Commissioner to send a fact-finding mission, or any other of the different tools that are at disposal. Because what you want to is, as I say, stop the abuses, prevent any further abuse. But even if that fails, to put pressure and add the Human Rights Council pressure to the international movement in favor of a solution of a conflict. I think the Human Rights Council must play a role, even if at the point of the final negotiation of peace, human rights are put in the backseat of the negotiation. But throughout the process, the Human Rights Council has a role to play, a responsibility. We, the members of the community, international community, should play a role. As I said, it's a moral obligation. Whether we play a role in the final steps of the negotiation or not, it's irrelevant. We need to put pressure, we need to stop the abuses, and we need to contribute to peace in any way we can for conflict to end.
Let me pick up on that and tie your very clear articulation of the moral responsibility to make sure that there's a focus on human rights with an earlier comment that you made briefly on amnesty versus accountability, the A words, so to speak. What are your views on the appropriate role, if any, for amnesty in a peace negotiation or in a peace process? Or you can approach the question from the other perspective of, what is the appropriate role, if any, for criminal accountability for atrocity crimes and human rights violations in a peace negotiation? Peace with justice, peace versus justice.
Yes. Well, in an ideal world, there shouldn't be a conflict between peace and justice. I mean, it should be peace and justice, and there shouldn't be accountability, and abusers should pay. But the reality, and when we leave the theoretical world and we land on a practical world, well, we need to engage in a negotiation, and we need to convince Maduro to leave power in Venezuela. We need to offer him something. And therefore, this is where the aid comes. But after a guy like Maduro leaves, for instance, we can put in place a number of tools to guarantee at least some justice. And that includes that at least there is not repetition. And therefore, there should be a permanent, for a while at least, for a few years, of permanent monitoring of the situation after peace is achieved. So there is, so that the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner, civil society can immediately react at the first indication that those who were guaranteed or given certain levels of forgiveness do not engage again, and newcomers don't engage in further abuses. So that's first and foremost refutation. Second, forgiveness it doesn't mean forgetting, and therefore we have seen in the past in many of these cases in Chile and Argentina and Spain, in South Africa, commission of truth commissions, where you find what happened. And that's often very important for victims to be acknowledged formally that they suffer from those abuses. Then, as a result of a truth commission, even if no one goes to jail as a result, at least apologies, formal apologies from the system, and ideally also from perpetrators that will come out and say, I regret, we saw this on an individual basis after World War II. Eventually, we have seen some governments recognizing and apologizing to societies, their own societies and other countries. Usually that helps heal. And then for the permanent monitoring, I would argue that you need usually an office of the High Commissioner to be open in countries where there's been conflict, so that there's a daily monitoring, because it takes time. Not only you don't want repetition, but it takes time, sometimes a whole generation, for the culture of respecting human rights to trickle down to the bottom, from the top to the bottom, and sometimes from the bottom to the top. And usually an office of the High Commissioner in place can prevent, can stop, can make sure that corrections, immediate corrections are made. We see this in Mexico. We didn't have conflict, but we went through a transition, a democratic transition, and a change of regime, and the first alternates in power in the year 2000. And because the new government from a different party believed that a culture of violation of human rights was ingrained in the previous government, and that culture remained in place even after a new government was elected, that it was important to anchor the democratic transition in human rights and international scrutiny in order to stop, prevent, and change the culture of human rights violations on a daily basis. And for at least 2 decades, almost 2 decades, it worked really, really well. And Mexico became one of the countries that was more open to scrutiny, because it was part of the conviction that that was the way to anchor the transition, the democratic transition over the years, and prevent temptation from, say, the old regime to come back to the old ways. That is unfortunately not anymore happening since the new government that took office almost 6 years ago. But before that, it really worked well. So I would argue that that's a very important tool, much more than the UPR, I have to say, is.
Okay. Jorge, let's pick up on that a little bit. And are there ways or suggestions you have for anchoring this commitment, this conviction to a democratic transition that reflects human rights and supports human rights? Because oftentimes in a peace negotiation, we think that everything has to be written into the peace agreement in the 3 weeks at Dayton or the however many weeks, wherever that the negotiations are occurring, you need to put words on paper and get the parties to agree to it. And that's where the amnesty versus accountability, peace versus justice. But what you're describing is, yes, that's important, but the day after, the year after is just as important. Any practical suggestions you have for implementing the Mexico model in other countries? Again, Mexico wasn't post-conflict, but if there's other countries that are post-conflict, ways in which they could implement.
Well, as I'm partial to human rights, I don't know if that's feasible, but I would argue that as part of the written notes of an agreement, a peace agreement, there should be at least a footnote of commitment on the parties to the establishment of an office of the High Commission of Human Rights in the country for a certain period of 5 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, depends on the size of, and also a commitment of the parties to ratify, to sign and ratify certain treaties, conventions, human rights conventions and treaties that the country in question has not ratified, and implement and also engage as a result of those ratification or previous ratifications that were not really put into practice, to engage in the necessary transformation of the legal framework and of the bureaucratic organization of the country to make sure that the new commitments towards the protection of human rights, at least some of the basic human rights, because we've seen some of the conflict in some of the countries, not even the basic human rights are abided to, protected, that they are in practice protected. Because, Paul, as we have seen for the past, since the establishment of the Human Rights Council, at least, in many cases, the problem is the implementation rather than the ratification. So you need certain commitments with the ratification, signing and ratifying, but also implementing and those treaties. And for that, you sometimes need to make major adjustments to your laws, to your legal framework in the countries, and to the bureaucratic structure of the country.
Planting the seeds
Yes.
of future human rights mechanisms and protections by referencing the incorporation of treaties, possibly referencing creating a truth commission or domestic hybrid tribunals. Let's pick up a little bit back again to the Human Rights Council. Sorry for bouncing around back and forth, but the Human Rights Council has a long tradition of commissions of inquiry, which sometimes have quite a substantial impact. The earlier, I think they called it something else, but 1993 Commission of Inquiry that Sharif Bassioni headed up for the former Yugoslavia essentially was the precursor and led to the Security Council created Yugoslavia Tribunal. We've had commissions of inquiry on Syria, and there's kind of a so what? What has the impact been? And I ask this because whenever I'm interacting with the advocacy community, their number one priority is let's get the Human Rights Council to create a commission of inquiry, and that will prompt action. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the successes, some of the failures, and any suggestions or recommendations that you have for doing it better in the future?
I think that every tool of the Human Rights Council should be used. And I would welcome any suggestion at any juncture in any conflict of any way to move forward. Having said that, I sort of find certain elements of coincidence when a commission of inquiry produces results and when it doesn't. And I think that the key element is when you have a commission of inquiry that has the political support enough to go up to the Security Council for the next step, you have a success. That is the case of Yugoslavia. So you build up pressure, you have the findings, you have the necessary technical elements, but if you don't have the political will at the highest level where action can take place, in the case of Yugoslavia, was the establishment of a tribunal that only the Security Council could establish at the time. Now we have but that has a different story. Then you are at the next step, and the Commission of Inquiry was the precursor of something big that in the end was successful after so many years, but it turned out to be successful. The case of Syria didn't produce any result because there was no political will at the Security Council. It was stalled in the Security Council, it was vetoed essentially by the Russians, sometimes in support, silent, most of the time silent support of the Chinese, but it didn't go anywhere because it was stalled at the Security Council. The alternative is the Third Commission, but in the Third Commission of the General Assembly, as you know, is not 47 countries. It is one where countries with less commitment to the protection of human rights, unfortunately, have the majority. And therefore, whatever happens at the Human Rights Council that is referred to the General Assembly usually dies. So, yeah, you need the findings, you need the elements, you need the evidence to go to the next step. That's why I believe that the two elements that I referred to, the Office of the High Commissioner and the ratification, implementation of conventions and treaty is essential. And let me go back to the ratification and signature and implementation of treaty. The treaty body's review mechanism is extremely powerful. It is, in my view, much more demanding and powerful than the UPR, because you sit with independent experts rather than delegates that like to play horse trading in the Human Rights Council. So your ability as a state to put pressure, influence, or exchange niceties with an expert of a treaty body is less by far than your ability to influence your delegates, your body sitting next to you at the Human Rights Council.
Jorge, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you a couple of more questions, and because you've been so generous with your time already. And what do you see as the future of the intersection between human rights and building a durable peace, or between accountability and building a durable peace? Is it an upward trajectory, or are we moving in the right direction, or have we been backsliding and there's a need to call for dramatic engagement to stop the backsliding on human rights and the prevention of atrocity crimes?
I tend to think that the latter is it's a better reflection of the reality. If I compare the environment, the willingness, the mood of the Human Rights Council today to, let's say, 10 years ago, I see some sliding. Unfortunately, I see less commitment, less will. Of course, we went through the 4 years of Mr. Trump, which was extremely damaging, in my view, to the causes of human rights and the Human Rights Council, and the disengagement of the US. And I think that did a lot of damage. It helped the less committed, or sometimes worse than less committed to human rights, the Russias and the Syrias and the North Koreas of this world, to get involved and to gain the space. The Biden administration tried to recover some of that, and I think they did a pretty good job, but I don't believe they have reached the levels of engagement and the ability to influence and that were there before Mr. Trump. So I guess it's a combination, the lack of, I think that the multilateral system has suffered, the UN has suffered a lot, and therefore the ability to make progress and to reach at least the levels that we were before 2016, we need to engage, and maybe we need a big shakeup. I was hoping that the COVID pandemic will sort of break the mold, but after a couple of years afterwards, I believe that we went back to the comfortable levels of prior to the pandemic, and I'm not optimistic, so I'm hoping for the next shakeup. And of course, whatever happens in the US in November will play a major role, whether we like it or not. The US is a major player, and if it plays on the right side of the equation, it makes a big difference.
Let's leave our listeners with one or two or three key takeaways. Our listeners, a bulk of our listeners are young professionals or mid-career professionals looking to do, what you've done in your career, work for international organizations, work for your government on promoting and the protection of human rights, and in particular, building a durable peace. What one thing or a couple of things do you want our listeners to take away and remember as they launch or continue on their paths, seeking to protect human rights, seeking to build durable peace, seeking to solve this conundrum of peace versus justice?
Well, Paul, I would like to end on a good note, so I will make a couple of comments. The first one is that even if you fail at the Human Rights Council as a delegate, as a representative, it is incredibly uplifting to at least be able to contribute and to take part in it and to make sure that you make some progress, even if you cannot achieve everything you want. Because of the moral obligation, because I think it's part of a human nature to try to do good. And one place where you can do good, sometimes much more than others, is at the Human Rights Council. So I would encourage anyone who is willing to pursue this path to go and pursue and be ready to fight and be creative and be engaging, talk to people, listen to people, and find a pathway that is allows whatever situation, regardless of how bad it is, to move forward, even if it takes 2-3 years. If I was still in the Human Rights Council, I will keep going on in Syria, even after all the failures. I mean, you cannot give up. The second element, even after 2016, with the situation as it is today, with 3 major conflicts at least going on at the same time, I think that the world is much better off today than it was after the Second World War. The UN has played a major role, has made a huge contribution in shaping a new world in which there's a new culture, there's a framework, a tremendous amount of treaties, and a number of tools that you can use to protect human rights. So we are much better off than we were, and it is thanks to the UN and thanks to the Human Rights Council. And at regional level, I would say the same. The OAS has made tremendous contribution to the situations at regional level. In fact, people would be surprised at how much more effective can the OAS be compared to the UN, because some of these tools have teeth that can be used to engage and move forward. So I would say to whomever is listening, it is a very satisfying way to contribute to a better world, for a peaceful world, a world where we protect human rights better every day.
Jorge, your dedication to protecting human rights, coupled with your optimism, is one of the reasons why it's such an honor and a privilege for me to be able to work with you on our various PILPG projects, and why I'm so grateful that you've spent your generously spent your time with us today, sharing your thoughts and your insights on the relationship between human rights, accountability, and building a durable peace. And I'm encouraged by your words of optimism and your words of dedication. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and ideas and your perspectives. And thank you for the decades of work that you've committed to promoting and protecting human rights, and to your work on nuclear nonproliferation.
On the contrary, Paul, it was a pleasure, an honor, and good luck, and all the best.